didn't see you there. Lots to do today, so let's get started.
I'm usually gonna come up here and try to say that, oh, this guy's like a sovereign king and like he should be above the law. That's just false. This entire trial is completely
Speech.
Okay,
say thank you.
Next,
I'm so happy I won these wires.
All right, let's get started with appeasement. I'm going to flip back and forth between the packet and the PowerPoint. Pause it at any time you need more time with a page or a slide. Appeasement is defined as a policy of appeasing an enemy or potential aggressor by making concessions. And we know that following World War I, most nations were apprehensive about a Second World War and therefore began to make concessions to the Nazi Party in Germany and their allies. We actually see here a collection of cartoons created by Dr. Seuss criticizing American policies that promoted appeasement. A lot of our favorite cartoonists actually got their start as political cartoonists. Walt Disney, actually, the first time he ever had Donald Duck appear on screen was in a promotion, like a recruitment video for the U.S. Navy. I'm pretty sure it was the Navy, whatever Donald Duck is meant to represent. But he had a lot of chicks, chicks on his arms. And the whole idea was like, oh, if you enlist like Donald, you'll be a chick magnet. Anyway, appeasement timeline. There's a few things to add in the space you have to the right here. First, even before this timeline begins, we had involvement by fascist leaders in the Spanish Civil War of 1936. Spain low-key had a fascist leader until the 1970s. No big deal, it's fine. And then this annexation of Austria, Anschluss as it's known, is the premise of the movie Sound of Music. Everyone's favorite. But then in the 2 years leading up to World War II, we see continued aggressive acts on behalf of the Germans and their allies as they continued to add territory surrounding them in mainland Europe. You can see on the map above here. By 1939, they've expanded into parts of Eastern Europe through that annexation of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and eventually that invasion of Poland is what sparks World War II. After Yalta and Potsdam, we start to see tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grow as they develop plans for occupation zones of territory formerly occupied by Axis powers, namely Germany, and developed plans for rebuilding a lot of the regions affected by German expansion throughout Europe. This led to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization around the United States and the Warsaw Pact around the Soviet Union. Before we start to look more at the conflict that developed between the United States and the Soviet Union, take a moment to look at whatever became of the Allied and Axis powers that took part in World War I. You see very clearly the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the wealthiest and, in terms of their military, the most powerful nations in the world. We'll start to look at the origins of the Cold War. This page 19. Pause the video for as long as you need to read through and answer the questions that go along with the text. For the most part, we see a conflict developing between the United States and the Soviet Union over the containment of communism, where the Soviet Union was trying to expand communist ideals into territories they occupied in both Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia, and the United States trying to protect principles of democracy where they existed or introduce them where they did not through their involvement. So as soon as you finish page 19, we have notes for pages 20 through 22 on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Pause the video as needed to answer the questions that go along with each slide. We'll start with the Hungarian Revolt of 1956. This was the first of many revolts against Soviet rule that we saw throughout the Soviet bloc following World War II. So the Hungarian Revolt of 1956, the most significant aspect of this revolt was the Soviets' response to it. Troops were immediately sent in to put down a revolt in Budapest against Soviet rule under Khrushchev, who was newly appointed after Stalin's death in 1953, and faced a lot of challenges in sort of separating the Soviet Union's legacy from Stalin's legacy. And we'll talk more about that process of de-Stalinization later, but it is what it sounds like. So Czechoslovakia in 1968 came immediately after Khrushchev was undermined by the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was portrayed as a very weak leader, not just within the Soviet Union, but throughout the world because of his unwillingness to act against the United States and complying with U.S. requests to move the missiles that were placed in Cuba. So he was ousted by the Communist Party, replaced by Brezhnev, who came in, sort of the analogy I make is FDR to Truman. Like Brezhnev sort of saw as though he had something to prove to not just those living within the Soviet Union, but those living throughout the Soviet bloc. So we saw Czech leaders starting to loosen controls on censorship, and those efforts were crushed by Soviet forces. So as local authorities started to push back against Soviet control, they were again met by force. We have throughout most of Brezhnev's rule, I just like a lot of these interpretations of the relationship between Brezhnev and Nixon and other American leaders through this period. There should actually be a timeline on your worksheet showing who was President of the United States and leader of Russia throughout this entire period. And you see Brezhnev holds his rule for almost 2 decades. And a lot of that was because of this policy of détente, during which both the United States and the Soviet Union sort of held up on overt acts of aggression, stockpiling their nuclear, I don't even know what you would say, nuclear reserves. I don't know. They just made a whole bunch of weapons, but then never used any of them. They threatened to, but they didn't, because that would be crazy. And that's why I like this cartoon a lot, because you see all of the capacity that either nation has to really destroy the other, and they're just throwing little arrows at each other through the proxy wars that are being fought. These little proxy wars, we have a Cold War Hotspots project that you'll submit on Google Classroom sometime at the beginning of April to look at all of the different smaller conflicts that came out of the Cold War without a total war between both the United States and the Soviet Union. Gorbachev, let me just make sure he's on here. All right, so Gorbachev was a really important step in the process of democratizing Russia and dissolving the Soviet bloc. He had 2 policies we'll talk about later, Glasnost and Perestroika, which really sought to expand personal freedoms for people within Russia and also loosen controls that the government had over markets within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. His rule eventually resulted in the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was the first opposition movement to achieve free elections in the Soviet bloc since really the beginning of the Cold War, before the Soviet bloc ever even existed. It was a Polish trade union that sort of worked as a political party within Poland. 99% of chairs in the newly formed Senate that year were endorsed by Solidarity, maybe less of a political party and more of a political action committee. But the Woman of the Year, Time just did the 100 Women of the Year. Woman of the Year of 1990 was a woman involved with the Solidarity movement because it really influenced democratization, not just within the Soviet bloc, but throughout the world during this time. And throughout this unit, we're going to see processes of de-democratization at the beginning of the 1900s, and then toward the end of the 1900s, processes of democratization, which really fell in line with the timeline we see here in the Soviet Union and its bloc. All right, and of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is seen as the symbolic and historical end to the Cold War. I don't think there's much need for explanation there. That Iron Curtain had finally been pulled open. So here's where we start to look at individual leaders of Russia. If you want to go ahead to page 21, as soon as you've finished all of the notes on page 20, we'll start with Khrushchev. He was the first leader to succeed Stalin, or secede Stalin, however you say that, and pursued a really intense campaign of de-Stalinization. Statues of Stalin were removed throughout the country, and the Soviet Union really tried to distance itself from Stalin because of how oppressive his rule was. I mean, case in point, he basically starved Ukraine, like cut off their food supply for refusing to collectivize their farmland, give up their farmland for collectivization, rather. So Nikita Khrushchev, in terms of foreign policy, pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, again trying to save face after Stalin Stalin's rule had ended in 1953. He instigated the Cuban Missile Crisis by placing weapons in Cuba, and because of the peaceful resolution to that, as I said before, he was less than respected by foreign leaders throughout the world and by influential people within the Soviet Union. So his rule was pretty short-lived, as you can see here. Domestically, he again pursued de-Stalinization, crushed a revolt in Hungary to try to set an example for the rest of the Soviet bloc, trying to separate Stalin's communism from the form of communism that was now being practiced throughout the Soviet Union and its bloc, hiding from the world the problems that existed there, and approved the construction of the Berlin Wall, which became the symbol of the Cold War. His successor, Brezhnev, appreciate the illustrations, if you will, that you have in your packets. Domestically, he established or put forth, I guess, the Brezhnev Doctrine, which basically said, in any instance where there is a revolt against the Soviet Union, we will use all means necessary to crush it. And that wasn't just to maintain domestic stability and security, but also to prevent the rest of the world from seeing the flaws that existed in this Soviet system, in this communist system. In terms of foreign rule, he had the longest, almost 20 years of rule during the Cold War, so most of the proxy wars were fought under Brezhnev's rule. Most notably, the SALT treaties, the arms limitation treaty between Carter and the United States and the Soviet Union. These eventually failed because of the USSR's involvement in Afghanistan. This is one of the hotspots you'll be including in your project. So it's just interesting to see how something so promising was so quickly dissolved. Gorbachev's foreign policy, he withdrew from Afghanistan, ceased the arms race with the United States, and made really any effort he could to restore relationships with between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States, and effectively end the Cold War by dissolving that Soviet bloc. Domestically, this meant initiating a very intense process of democratization, moving more toward a democratic system rather than a socialist system, denouncing the Brezhnev Doctrine, and therefore enabling satellite states or members of the Soviet bloc to challenge Soviet rule and eventually become their own independent states, separating themselves from the Soviet Union. So there was an extreme financial crisis that Russia faced in 1991 as a result of the dissolution of the USSR, but he was recognized with a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, and eventually Russia restabilize, its economy restabilize, and it's again one of the most powerful nations in the world, which we'll see in just a moment. How this was actually achieved, if you look down at the bottom of the page where you see 1, 2, and 3, the 1, 2, and 3 would certainly be these policies, 1 and 2 of perestroika, 1 and 2 glasnost. Perestroika wanted to move the nation away from a communist system toward a democratic system by enabling the economy to function separately from the state. So it was through this process that the economy within Russia became more of a free market economy. And then we also have glasnost, which really just sent to ease social controls, censorship, things like that, which again enabled satellite states to challenge Soviet authority. Number 3 would be the collapse of the Soviet Union. Without the dissolution of what was essentially a modern empire, we wouldn't have seen democratization happening to the extent that it did throughout the Soviet bloc and in Russia itself. Okay. So once you have answered the question down at the bottom of page 22, we can take a look at modern Russian government following the Cold War, which is really defined by the rule of Vladimir Putin, who has been leader there for like 47 years. And I am exaggerating, that's not really how long he's been a leader. However, this article goes through a summary of Putin's rise to power and his preservation of that power. This is 1 or 2 years old, though, so that whole situation with the law that was passed to extend his presidency or enable his re-election or whatever happened a couple months ago is not yet included. Since then, he's taken further steps to ensure that he could continue to rule Russia in the capacity that he has for the last decade. So after you read and take a look at some of the slides that go through Russians' involvement abroad today, you can place Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and Putin on this matrix. It's not really a spectrum, is it? Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, it is a spectrum, because here we just have the y-axis. This is just over time. I'm not going to count that. So from authoritarian and oppressive to representative and open, where would you place each of these leaders in comparison to one another? The last thing I'll talk about is the Cold War Hotspots Project. This is due again at the beginning of April. You're just going to be looking at, yes, all of these different hotspots, summarizing them briefly on 4 different maps. If you do it digitally, you'll only need 1 map, but if you do it on paper, you just won't have room for your summaries of all of these different instances on the back of 1 page. But really, however you'd like to, you just have to include a brief summary of each of these hotspots and then actually plot them on the map so you can see how global this conflict was. Today's question of the day actually comes from my parents. Yes, I am practicing what I preach. I visited my parents for the first time since this summer, because of the pandemic. And I think that you will find a lot of your parents, many of your parents, used to be cool like me. So here's my mom and dad. Hey Mom, what do you think my students should ask their parents?
Can I get the chocolate out of my teeth first and out of my mouth?
That makes it more engaging.
I think your students should ask their parents how school is different today than it was when they went to school.
Hey kids. Ask your parents what's the closest thing to this pandemic that they ever encountered while they were young.